Go ahead and get started. My name is Joe Myers, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Victoria Haskins, who's going to give us a lecture. And the way she's going to do it is she's going to lecture for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period. And depending on how she feels, she may or may not take questions. If you have a cell phone, make sure it's turned off. Otherwise, we'll confiscate it and we won't return it to you. I have to read this resume because I don't know all of the things that Victoria has done, but she's done a lot. And it's certainly my pleasure to introduce you to her. She's professor of history, and she's the director of the Puri Global Indigenous and Diaspora Research Study Center at the University of Newcastle. And I assume that's in Australia, right? She received her PhD in philosophy from the University of Sydney. She's a historian of Indigenous and women's histories. Her key research interests are in gender, labor, and cross-cultural relationships, with a focus on settler colonialism in Australia and the United States. She has published widely in the area of Indigenous domestic service histories and colonization, and utilizes comparative and transnational approaches to history. She's written several books, including One Bright Spot, which was published in 2005, Uncommon Ground, White Women in Aboriginal History, also published in 2005, Matrons and Maids, published in 2012, Colonization and Domestic Service, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives, published in 2015, and her most recent publication is with John Maynard, and it's called Living with the Locals, published this year. And in 2013, she was awarded the New South Wales Centenary of Anzac Commemoration History Fellowship to research the impact of World War I on women in New South Wales. Victoria is currently in the United States researching a transnational history of violence and intimacy in the Pacific Rim settler societies. The title of her talk today is The Indian Maiden is Not Allowed to Pine in Loneliness. So please welcome Professor Haskins. Sure.
Thanks, Joe. Now I have to get my notes because I have to read from notes. But thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for coming all this way to listen to my talk, and thank you for allowing me the space to give this talk. And I'd like to also thank Christine and Cynthia for helping it happen, and really also big thanks to Katie Kelly-Yaha for making it happen. So it's very exciting for me to have this opportunity to talk. But before I begin, I just want to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking on today, the Makwekma Ohlone. So, yeah, today the what?
No, just a clarification. I just wonder what pine means in the title. Are you going to get into that?
Sorry?
Pine.
What the word pine
and
means?
loneliness.
Pine. As in to pine away, to suffer. It's like to lose yourself. So the research, I'm here, the talk I'm going to give today is based on some research that I'm doing right now. This week I've been working in Bancroft, and next week I'm going north to Arcata and Requa. And it's very much work in progress. And so I am going to take questions, and I'll be really interested in the questions you have and any thoughts you have about this, because I am kind of pulling it together at the moment. The talk is a smaller piece of a much larger project that I'm working on about the history of and impact of state policies of forcibly taking Indigenous girls from their communities and their families to place them to work as servants in white homes. These policies operated in Australia and in the US at about the same time, from the late 19th century through to the onset of the Second World War. They continued after that as well in some forms, but not to the extent that they were beforehand. And this larger project I've got the working title of In Her Place, Native American and Australian Aboriginal Women Working in White Homes, Stories from the Archives, is based on several years of research I've been doing in the very extensive government records that were compiled in both countries as a result of these histories. And now I'm building a book around a series of particular stories that leapt out of the archives at me and kind of got a hold of me and wouldn't let go. I'm really fascinated by the written archival record and the ways that in it you can see the voices of the past being variously muted, ventriloquised, enlarged and fragmented. And this it's particularly interesting seeing how this happens within records of repression, which the government archives are when they are dealing with Indigenous people. So as a historian, I see myself as first and foremostly a storyteller rather than a theorist or analyst. And I feel I can make my most valuable contribution in using my expertise and my experience in the archives to draw out and to develop these echoes to tell hidden and forgotten histories. And so the story I'm going to talk about today, about Ruth Roberts and the Yurok Club, is one of these histories. But before I dive into it, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from. Make this magic thing work. So I'm not Indigenous, I'm a white Australian, but my interest in this history came out of my own personal family connections to it. My great-grandmother, Joan Kingsley Strack, a well-to-do Sydney housewife, was an activist for Aboriginal citizenship rights in the 1930s, and she worked with a very well-known and important Aboriginal activist called Pearl Gibbs to raise support for the citizenship rights movement from the women's organisations at the time. Gibbs and my great-grandmother both focused on trying to end the New South Wales government policy of taking Aboriginal girls from their families and forcibly apprenticing them as servants in white homes. Now what's remarkable about my great-grandmother's story is that she arrived at her activist position through her relationships with 4 Aboriginal women who she employed as domestic workers in her own home, and they'd come to her having been forcibly removed from their families to be placed in service under that very policy that she ended up opposing. So researching and writing her story set me on a trajectory of looking for other histories of Indigenous domestic service and the subversive potential that might be within that history of bringing Indigenous girls into white homes. Now what I found was, in the very vast majority of cases, putting Aboriginal or Native American girls in service had a purely repressive effect on women's relationships. It generated an alienation and a very deep bitterness that I think continues to impact on relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous women today. Well, that's not particularly surprising. Domestic labour is an occupation that's paradoxical in the emotional intimacies and separations it demands of both worker and employer at the same time. And scholars of the occupation have pointed to the ways that domestic service operates to define, maintain and strengthen uneven power relations of gender, class and race. And yet, even so researching this, I continue to be startled by rare and unexpected stories like my great-grandmother's, where something rather different seems to be going on. The promise of other possibilities can be seen, and the story of Ruth Kellett Roberts and the Yurok Club is one such story. So, I'll begin. In June 1928, a feature article in the San Francisco Examiner gave coverage to an interesting new initiative in the Bay Area. Every Thursday afternoon, a group of young Indian women living in the Bay Area gathered together to enjoy, quote, authentic Indian songs, dances and mutual talk in the redwood panelled living room of a Piedmont woman, Mrs. Ruth Kellett Roberts. Depicting Roberts and some of the young women, including the club's president, Alice Spott. The article explained that the girls all came from Del Norte County in northwestern California. Roberts was in the practice of sending word to young women from the area when she heard of places for them where they could work as live-in domestics in the homes of Roberts' friends and acquaintances. Once here, the article went on, the Indian maiden is not allowed to pine in loneliness, but is drawn into interesting contacts under the chaperonage of Mrs. Roberts. And so the formation of the Yurok Club was announced. So who was she then, this Mrs. Roberts? Born in 1885 in Calistoga, reared in the Napa Valley, and a graduate of Mills College, she clearly came from moneyed stock somewhere along the line. Since 1915, she's been dividing her time between the Bay City of Oakland and a small village on the far northwest coast of the state, where her husband is employed as an accountant for a salmon packing company. The village is Requa, Del Norte County, on the mouth of the Klamath River where it opens into the Pacific. And I hope that most of you know where Requa is, but many Americans I've spoken to don't actually know where it is. So, does everyone know where it is? I don't have to show you on the map. It's just up there. Mrs. Roberts and her son have been going there regularly for the commercial fishing seasons, down to one summer run a year now. This is 1928. Her son is now 18, so she's got quite a bit of free time. As the chairman of Indian Welfare for the San Francisco district of the Californian Federation of Women's Clubs and a member of the Indian Defense Association, the IDA, and I'll be talking about the IDA a bit more, so I'll use that acronym. Ruth is very active in both the women's movement and the cause of Indian reform. For the past 3 years at least, she's been involved with campaigns to reduce the power of the federal government over Indian people in California and campaigns to have the state provide social services to Californian Indians. Roberts has also had a very specific concern with issues relating to the Yurok Indians living in and around Requa, and particularly has actively spoken out against any moves to construct dams along the lower Klamath that would destroy the salmon runs and the commercial fishing industry that employs many Yurok people and, of course, her husband. In 1926, Roberts assisted a number of Yurok men to come to San Francisco and speak to white audiences about the injustices they endured. The following year, she bought a rambling old two-storey house in Piedmont, the booming City of Millionaires, as it was called in the 20s, and began making plans to start what she would call her placement adventure, bringing girls and young women down from Requa and surrounds to live and work right amongst her target audience. From the time she first arrived at Requa, Roberts was enthralled by the Indian people there, going about their everyday lives in their ancestral village, Requa, just a mile upstream from the cannery. By 1918, she'd struck up a strong friendship with a Yurok mother about the same age as herself, Alice Spott. That friendship would sustain her in her connections at Requa to both the people and the place for many years. 1933 saw the closing of the cannery, with the banning of commercial and tribal gill-net fishing and an end to the Roberts visits. In 1955, Ruth Roberts and husband returned to the Del Norte County to live in Crescent City, where she remained until her death in 1967. She's kind of an engaging and unique character, this Ruth Kellett Roberts. She caught my attention when I first stumbled across a mention of her amongst the records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs outing matron in San Francisco, Mrs. Bonnie V. Royce. Still haven't worked out what the V stands for. A woman of the same vintage as Roberts, if not background. she'd been overseeing the placement of Indian girls from her residential offices in Prince Street, Berkeley, since 1920 under the BIA Outing program. As the widow of a former superintendent of the Carson or Stewart Indian School in Nevada, from where she received virtually all of her young charges, Royce was well aware of the several entwined purposes in bringing these young women to work in the wealthy suburbs of the Bay. These purposes had been in place since the scheme first began as an experiment proposed by a previous superintendent in 1912. They were to civilise and assimilate Indian girls in the values of middle-class Anglo-American domesticity, to provide supervised employment experience in the kind of labour deemed appropriate for their race, station and gender, and, perhaps most importantly, to ensure that during the long summer vacation period, having been kept at a strict distance during the school year from their own families and communities, that they were not allowed to return to them and their influences. Now, it's evident that Roberts and the Yurok Club was something of a sore point for matron Bonnie Royce. In April 1930, Royce complained about Roberts' activities to the Carson Superintendent and the BIA State Supervisor of Education for California. Royce's complaint, in a nutshell, was that the young women being placed in homes by Roberts were subsequently refusing Royce's counsel and advice as outing matron and refusing to abide by our rules and regulations. This, Royce stated, was causing, quote, considerable unrest and discontent among the other girls. She wanted the Indian office to confirm her understanding that she, in fact, had authority over all of the Indian girls who came to the Bay Area to work. Royce went on to explain that when Roberts first brought down a cohort of young women from Requa in the fall of 1927 to place them, she'd done so with Royce's knowledge and endorsement. This was probably because Roberts' initiative was nicely timed with the directive Royce had received from the Indian office to extend her outing program beyond the Carson schoolgirls. And indeed, the first sign of Royce's activities in this direction was a note that she had presumably herself placed in a local Del Norte newspaper in 1927, before she left, advising young Indian women that if any of them sought employment in the Bay Area, they could write to Mrs. Royce in Berkeley or, alternatively, apply directly to Roberts at Requa. Such cordiality would not last, however, and clearly over the past 2 years, tensions between the two women had developed. Not at all shy of using her newspaper contacts to advertise her activities from the very beginning, Roberts showcased the Yurok Club in various illustrated reports, informing readers that the club, affiliated at first as a junior club to the California Federation of Women's Clubs, and then later as a full adult club, was being provided with special educational and entertainment programs sponsored by the Oakland Civic Centre. Royce, meanwhile, coming under some pressure from the new administration of Commissioner Charles Rhodes after 1929 to explain the embarrassing moral questions, these being illegitimate pregnancy, venereal disease and prostitution, that had arisen among the girls during her tenure, she emphasised the constraints on her capacity to provide social outlet activities for the outing girls due to the lack of space in her office and the restrictions on the use of the space that they had at the YWCA in Oakland. The Oakland YWCA, which Katie and I are going to go and look at tomorrow, and which had catered to the outing girls to some extent since 1915, apparently supported a group of the outing girls, the Four Winds Club, but that club does not seem to have been very active. The earliest contemporary record I've found on it so far is a brief reference in September 1928, many months after the Yurok Club had started making headlines. In any case, Roberts' very visible promotion of the Yurok Club tended to show up Royce's relatively lacklustre performance. Tellingly, at the time Royce made her complaint, Roberts, with the help of the IDA's secretary Rachel Barker, was busily making arrangements so that the Yurok women she sponsored could access the YWCA without going through Royce. The IDA had managed to secure a commitment from the management of the Oakland YWCA that Indian girls who were not federal wards were able to utilise the facilities and services of the Y, including its employment services and its swimming tanks, just like other Californian citizens. Furthermore, Roberts had secured in writing the rights of these same girls to meet freely on the premises without any supervision other than that of the YWCA itself, which was clearly directed at keeping the outing matron at a distance. Federal employees might be welcomed occasionally as guests, not as directors of activities. The upshot was that the YWCA undertook to host the two groups of young women separately, what they called the non-reservation girls and the reservation girls, with meetings being held on alternate Thursday afternoons. Now, this development would surely have been seen as a challenge by Royce and indeed a threat. The legal status of the Yurok girls was somewhat complicated, and this is where I'm still really haven't clarified this at all in my head, and hoping that I will be able to. Some of the young women came from the Hooper Valley Reservation. Now the boundaries, and I know I overheard we have got a Yurok person in the room who might be able to advise me on this, but the boundaries of the Hooper Valley Reservation ran down alongside the Klamath River. The women who came from that reservation might be classified as ward Indians, I'm not sure, and yet others had sold their allotments, or their families had, which complicates the things. So there's a complication about those Yurok girls' status, but another pertinent issue, which I think Royce would have been really aware of, was the status of some of the older girls employed under the outing program in the Bay, who might technically also be viewed as non-ward Indians, because I'm also finding this kind of what's called a general understanding, very hazy legal language there, that Californian Indian women over the age of 21 lost their status as wards once they had been away from their home or reservation for more than 2 years. So, anyway, in fact, the following year, the respective status of Roberts' girls and Royce's girls, as they were starting to be called, I know it sounds quite offensive, but that's actually how they were being called, that was a question that came to the head. It was then that the IDA Secretary, Rachel Barker, wrote to the Commissioner, alerting him to the several complaints they had received from different girls working in the Bay. That their matron arbitrarily takes away their earnings and doles them out to them at will what money she thinks they should have. Explaining that the outing girls were in touch with other Indian girls working in the Bay who were not under federal regulation, Barker said that these outing girls wanted to know what their rights were, and the IDA wanted to know what the regulations were when it came to wages earned off the reservation by Indian wards. Royce was then asked by the Commissioner to report on her practice. Evidently, there were no formal regulations, and she very crossly replied. Defending her practice of requiring all but the most responsible of the girls to hand over their wages to her to hold in trust, Royce declared darkly that in the past 2 years, propaganda and interference from outside had not only encouraged a few irresponsible and problem girls to complain, but that this influence had created dissatisfaction and discord among the Indians here, detrimental to their best interest and causing the outing centre considerable annoyance and embarrassment. Now, Royce had a supporter, a very firm, strong supporter, in the BIA State Supervisor of Education, who drew the headquarters' attention to the constant criticism that she was under from self-appointed guardians of Indian welfare. And in the end, Roberts' activities would be curtailed by the intervention of the BIA's field representative in California, a Miss Mary McGair. Meeting with Roberts in May 1931, McGair firmly directed her that under the BIA regulations, she must strictly confine her voluntary activities to non-ward Indians only. Affronted, Roberts decided to quit altogether. She declared she did not want to confuse the girls, but her decision was at least partly premised on her need now, as the Depression set in, to find employment herself. As it turned out, Roberts continued to take an interest in the Yurok women and even helped a few she already knew well to find work in the Bay. But by 1933, the Roberts had left their big house in Piedmont and were back in Oakland. That year, Royce resigned suddenly, shortly after her brother, who lived with her, was accused of preying upon the Outing girls. Mildred Van Every, employed through the Oakland YWCA, took over the Indian placement program in the Bay. Royce's Four Winds Club continued under Van Every and is still remembered today as the forerunner of the intertribal friendship house here in the Bay. But the Yurok Club folded with Roberts' withdrawal in May 1931 and has all but disappeared in the mists of history. So that's the story. And having presented that kind of overview of it, in the time left to me, I just want to talk about what's interesting or significant about it and what kind of direction or line I'm pursuing in my analysis of the story. And so that's where I'll be, very interested to get feedback, particularly on what kind of questions it raises for you. So my first question, I suppose, is whether it has any significance at all. This funny little short-lived Indian Girls Club, engineered by a rather quirky, if enthusiastic, society lady, as she was sometimes called, was it just a storm in a teacup, a curious micro-history that made barely a ripple? Or is there something we can learn from looking more closely at the Yurok Club to help us understand the history of Indian government policy and practice? How does it help us gauge the political significance and impact of women's work, both as advocates for Indian policy reform and quite literally in terms of the domestic labour performed by Indian women in white families, from white families? So the first point I'd emphasise is Roberts' notion that domestic employment of Indian girls could somehow be a strategy of political engagement. The anthropologist Arnold Pilling, who met Roberts at the very end of her life, articulated it as such. In her one-woman battle for California Indian rights, said Pilling, Roberts deployed as a tactic this exposure of Yurok young ladies to the wealthy homes of the East Bay of the San Francisco area. Her so-called placement adventure followed on the heels of both her having brought down Indian men to speak publicly on Yurok issues, and this picture here comes from the year beforehand, and it shows Robert Stott, who came down and gave a very hard-hitting talk about, basically the lack of land rights for his people. And the other thing that it followed on was her having coaxed some influential white acquaintances from the city up to Requa to meet with Indian people there and get a little taste of Indian culture to try to make them more sympathetic to Indian issues. It may have occurred to Roberts that it could be more effective to bring Yurok girls to San Francisco and install them directly into her friends' homes where white women could start to learn about the reality of Indian people's lives. Such an idea seems terribly naive, doesn't it? I was at a friend's place for dinner on Sunday night and I was telling these people about the story, and she said to me about Roberts, whatever made her think anyone would be interested in the servant's story? And that really struck a chord with me, because I sometimes think whatever makes me think anyone would be interested in the servant's story in terms of the history that I write. But still, the fact that Roberts thought this way gives us just a bit of an insight into the subversive possibilities when young Indigenous women went to work in white homes. And I do think that's worth exploring, even if it's a kind of crazy idea that never really went anywhere. Because, of course, the majority of employers do not listen to the servant's story. The second point, I think, deserves deeper analysis and attention is the distrust and suspicion Roberts and her club aroused for the authorities at all levels. And even the IDA secretary seemed picking up some sense that she started to distance herself a bit from Roberts. And this is certainly about more than Roberts' group being a kind of competition to the government scheme. Roberts' project offered an apparent alternative, quite a distinct alternative to the outing system, an alternative in which the Indian girls themselves exercised autonomy and a degree of power. Through the Yurok Club, the young domestic workers presented not as primitive or demoralised people in need of the watchful moral guardianship exerted by outing matrons and employers, but rather as confident and modern young women, secure in their own traditional culture, but also prepared to embrace the political opportunities afforded by contemporary women's associations in the urban space. And it was this, I think, that made the Yurok Club a problem for authorities as a model that encouraged other Indian girls to begin asserting themselves. And then related to both of those points is a third and perhaps the most important aspect, which is the question of the agency of the Yurok within Roberts' placement activities and in the club itself. Certainly the young women weren't pawns to be manipulated for Roberts' politicking. As a non-Indigenous and non-Yurok person, I hesitate to speak on their perspectives and motivations. But it is obvious that Roberts could not have done what she did without the active and committed engagement of both the girls themselves and their wider community. Alice Spott, whose daughter Minnie was consistently a leader in the Yurok Club, was a key person, and it's not beyond possibility that she, Alice Spott, may have even helped Roberts devise the plan. And Robert, I should say, of course, is Alice Spott's brother. In the scattered records that I found within the IDA papers, it's also clear that the young women set their own agenda when it came to both their political and their social activities. There's a little bit of some argy-bargy going on where Roberts doesn't agree with what they're doing, but they're going to do it anyway. Roberts is basically limited to advising them from her respected position as an older woman, and I think she sort of has that kind of status. She also worked with their parents to establish the parameters of her authority. While the Yurok girls' employment in the Bay was clearly fitted foremostly around the needs of their families, so the families have the ultimate authority, and girls returned from the Bay with Roberts for the annual salmon season and or when they're needed back at home, which is quite different to the outing system. This deference to the Yurok home community's needs stands in complete contrast to the outing program, which aimed from the beginning at breaking parental and tribal authority, and which operated to keep the young women from their own families and to remove them as a resource from their communities. So I'll conclude there, leaving those thoughts before you. But as I said, I'm interested to hear of your thoughts. For me, Mrs. Roberts and her Yurok Club interrupt an overly simplistic construction of the significance of domestic employment in white homes for the history of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships. So I think it shows how complex this was. Only a couple of historians have noticed Roberts and the Yurok Club, and they've read it as an episode evidencing Royce's sensitivity to competition. But I think that misses the more intriguing challenge that the Yurok Club posed to the larger administration, beyond Royce. And even though it achieved little more than some aggravation and was easily quashed by little more than a raised eyebrow in the end, it still provides us with a distinct insight into both the nature of domestic employment in the outing program as a strategy of state control, by showing what it isn't, and the way in which an alternative domestic placement system established in cooperation with Indian people themselves could subvert and challenge that control. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I'm more familiar with the Native American, the boarding schools where young children were taken from the reservations and forced into the boarding schools, and were punished for speaking their language or practicing any of their native ways. It was like kicking the Indian out of them and trying to make them white. I wondered there's two movies about that, and one was in Australia, Rabbit Proof Fence,
Yeah.
and Where the Spirit Lives is a terrific movie that was made in Canada.
Yeah.
I recommend it. You seen it?
I haven't. I have heard of
Where
it.
the Spirit Lives. And I'm wondering if your work touches on the boarding schools, and also how old were these girls, and were there resistance to serving in homes?
Okay, so my work touches a lot on boarding schools because the outing system really comes out of the boarding schools in the first place. So some, some of the stories I'm looking at are coming out of Carlisle, and was where the outing program started. Haskell is another Indian school which had a lot of outing, and I've got another story that comes out of Haskell. In Australia, because I'm doing comparative transnational work, Australia doesn't have that boarding school side. We have the same kind of placement policies, but it's totally disconnected from education. They are just taken from their communities, put straight into domestic service. So, yes, I do talk about boarding schools. In this situation, there was the schooling system. There was a school at Hooper Valley, I think, but I know that Roberts was trying to get the kids schooling in a local school at Requa. I don't know how much. There was a bit of going to boarding school, but it's not a big part of their story. And the last question.
How old were the girls?
How old were the girls?
And mainly, was there resistance?
Right. So the Roberts girls came down, and Roberts were older. They were mostly around about. Alice Minnie was 20. They were around about the age of 20, late teens, early 20s. There was one young one, at least one young girl came down. She was only 13, and her uncle came down after her and was quite concerned about her being so young. And Mrs. Roberts had to, do some discussion with him about where the girl would be because of her extreme youth. The girls coming from the Carson School were a bit younger, I think. They were probably around about 15. Would that be right, Katie? Yeah, so they're a bit younger. In terms of resistance, there's quite a lot of resistance from the outing girls, and I think I've touched on that a little bit with the particular opposition to their wages being taken from them. And I find that really interesting because the withholding of wages is a big issue in Australia for Aboriginal people. One of the sort of little side stories in this, which I'll talk about when I write this up. So Margaret Marks, who later becomes a leading activist in the 1970s. Roberts writes a little bit about her and says she detests housework. So we have to, we can't get her a position doing housework because she absolutely hates it. But because they had more control over that, they weren't forced to go to work. So they basically contacted her and asked her to help them find work. A number of them did other kinds of work, but mostly they were doing housework. There was some student nurses. Minnie Spott did some teaching, and then she later became a cook. And a cook is like the top layer for domestic workers. So she was on a very high salary. So.
Can I comment? You guys have studied the Native women much more closely than I have, but the Yurok women seem to me to be very competitive, if you will. When you go to Requa, there's a woman who's the chief judge of their tribal court,
Yeah.
and you may have already known about her. But her name is Abby Abenanti, and you might want to visit with her when you're up there. She's the first Native woman to become a member of the California Bar Association.
Yeah.
She's an attorney. And she has put that court together and has done a very good job. And there are other women from Yurok and Hupa who are very political with their tribal councils and so forth. And you use the term wards,
Yeah.
and I think that the distinction there is that these women come from federally recognized tribes, so therefore they're automatically wards, they're considered wards, and whatever that means. But the meaning that I get from it, they're eligible for educational benefits, and I don't know whether you can call them benefits or not, but they're eligible for programs from the federal government through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In your research, did you find out what the connection was between this outing program, which is private, and how they were able to get the Bureau of Indian Affairs to agree to let them have an outing program that's private as opposed to the boarding school outing program?
Well, that's the issue, I think, because so the Royce's outing program was the BIA one. That was the official one, and Roberts was not called outing, and she never gave it a name except for calling it her placement adventure. But it was there was at that time it was kind of it was actually a job for kind of respectable working class women to set themselves up as brokers to find domestic service positions, to find placements. So Roberts was kind of in a way doing that, but those women used to take commissions kind of thing. They were like finders of workers, or you had to pay a certain amount of your first wage to that person for them to get you a job. Whereas Roberts was quite, adamant about that she didn't take any payment for what she was doing. So it was philanthropic sort of thing. The BIA, this is where the ward thing gets fussy, because she was saying, and the Yurok girls are saying, we don't come under the outing system because we're not wards. So, and that's where I'm confused about how they define their status, given that there's the reservation. And I don't know whether it's because technically the villages where they're born are not within that little one thing I read described it as the tail of a kite coming down.
Well, Requa was not necessarily on a reservation.
Yeah.
But at various points historically, Indian communities or Native communities had decided to kind of resist the ward identity, and because they wanted to fit in, if you will, to the non-Indian communities, so they kind of rejected the Indian identity. They didn't want to live on the reservation or rancherias. How long that lasted? It lasted several years, but it was during the 40s and the 50s. And then later on in the 70s, there was more of a kind of a renaissance back to native cultures. And so this identity thing changed.
Yeah.
I think that the ward identity might have been a problem during the time that of your research?
Well, you've got the Citizenship Act in 1924.
24, right.
And I haven't found any documentation that links her directly with the campaigns and things that were going on at that time. But from the standpoint that she took later, I'm sure that she was pro-citizenship. You know, she would have been a very strong advocate for citizenship.
You mentioned the allotments.
The allotments. I need to read some more on Yurok history, because one thing I came across was, I'm really wary of saying the wrong thing. I do think I saw something about people taking allotments.
Well, the reservation runs from the Yurok reservation runs from the western boundary of the Hupa reservation along the Klamath River to the Pacific Ocean, and the land is a mile on the north side of the river and a mile on the south side, and that's where the allotments probably were placed. In fact, there was a case that I read several years ago where a non-Indian wrote a letter to a friend of his saying to him that this Indian woman, Yurok woman, had an allotment which had virgin redwood trees on it and was very expensive if you wanted to cut those trees down for lumber.
Yeah.
And so what he did was he married her and tried to, and I guess he was successful, tried to get her to allow him to cut the timber. So some of those things happened, but the allotments for the Yurok people, it seems to me, could have been very expensive allotments with those virgin timber.
And so when the salmon fishing stopped, there's a little bit of material there with Roberts talking with people up that way about getting into lumber as a way of making a living instead. So that happens as well. I'd like to know, I'm trying to find out more about the whole issue with the dams in Klamath, which I know is like an issue right now, because that was Roberts' probably, key campaign was about stopping the dams on the Klamath.
I think they removed at least one dam they wanted to remove.
Yeah. Well, she was there at the point where they were starting to put them in. So I find that very interesting. But your other point about the Yurok women, I've been reading a little bit of the sort of anthropological literature around the Yurok, and one of the things that I've come across there is that the Yurok doctoring was a province for the women, which is unusual apparently, and a sort of index of the strength and the power that women held in that community, which I found interesting. And so this could have made a difference to Roberts' ability to do what she did as a woman herself, and being able to get support from women in the community. That kind of the status of women in the Yurok community might have been a significant part of the story, which I should perhaps look at.
Yeah, and there's a woman by the name of Matson. Her first name slips me, but she was
Geneva?
this one is political. She's been chair of the Yurok tribe before, and you might want to meet her up there, as well as Abby Avenanti. They can give you a lot of information on the history of the Yurok women. So they lived the ability to become powerful in their communities themselves. So, I don't want to mess with them because they're too tough for me.
Well, I'm when I do research, I like the communities that I'm researching, histories that are relevant to them, to know what I'm doing. So I'm heading up that way to hopefully make people aware that I'm around and I'm doing it, and if they, want me to stop or change my focus or
I'm sure
address it.
they'd be very receptive to your research, and they all know about the history of the dams and so forth, so you get a lot of information by being on site.
Well, I'm kind of, when I'm working in archives, I find that certain stories start to just keep coming out at me, and every time I open another folder there's another bit of material that relates to it, and sometimes I think, well, this story wants me to tell it, so I'll go ahead and see where it takes me. So.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's a very interesting project, and I'm quite sure the Yurok people will be very pleased to embrace you.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I think it's quite a compelling story.
Good.
Hi. In Australia, you've got quite a few stories written by women who've been done domestic service and so on later on. Are there autobiographies and other things to draw upon here that people have written reflecting back on their experiences?
I found small snippets in Native American women's biographies where they would maybe talk for a short while, but compared to If Everyone Cared, the Australian book, where they actually really talk about it at great length and talk about the politics of it. There's nothing comparable to that, but it's there in the autobiographies. But for the Bay Area, off the top of my head, do you know if there's anything?
I don't think so.
Off the top of my head, I can't think. I have, I've just a couple of days ago found the diary of one of the women, one of the outing girls.
Yes,
So I'll have to talk to you about that. But it's written after she stopped work, just after she stopped work, but still, it's pretty exciting.
Domestic pursuits seem to be a fabric of American society, because when I was going to high school 100 years ago, home economics was a required program for the young women in high school. And that's probably where society, at least at that time, looked for women to be limited, to learn how to cook and wash dishes and wash clothes and do ironing in the home, and let the man go out and conquer the world.
The theory of domestic labour and the need of capitalism to have unpaid workers performing reproductive labour. There's quite a lot of scholarship on that, and you can really see it emerging from the, in the modern period, emerges as a theme that somebody's got to do that work, right? So, and no one's going to pay for it. Or if they're going to pay for it, they're going to pay a little for it. So.
I'm sure there's still a lot of racism towards Aborigines. Maybe could you say anything about the status of Aborigines today?
Oh, well, it's bad. The situation for Aboriginal people in Australia is bad. So all the measurements of social well-being and economic well-being, there's massive gaps. The racism continues to be a problem. Just a couple of weeks ago, very awful case in Western Australia where a young boy who stole a motorbike, was accused of stealing a motorbike, was run over and killed deliberately. And that kind of brought things to a head in that community, which is a mining town, and relations have historically been extremely bad between Aboriginal and white people.
Did the perpetrator get caught? The man
Yeah.
What's going to happen to him?
I don't know where it's at the moment. He was brought to court to determine whether he should be charged with murder or manslaughter. And I don't recall. I don't know. Have you been? I think he might have been charged with manslaughter rather than murder.
I think it was a lesser charge.
Yeah, which had caused a lot of
upset people.
Yeah.
Also, they shut out economically and educationally.
Yeah. There's no. We have anti-discrimination laws, which our government sometimes tries to turn back. But there's social discrimination, and there's just the whole effects of poverty that make people less likely to be able to take opportunities as well. But the remote communities have a lot of problems to do with, just sort of basic stuff like running water and that kind of thing. Yeah.
One last thing, do they live in communities or reservations? Or?
The largest Aboriginal population lives in Sydney, not on reservations. We have, it's a different system. There's no treaties in Australia, there's no history of treaties, there's no recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty. There was gazetted reserves all around Australia, and these have been the places where Aboriginal communities have established themselves, and some of those are on traditional lands and others are where people have been herded onto them and pushed across, and they vary in what they like. There's been, I'm trying to summarise the whole of Australia. Australia's as big as the US, so it's a bit hard to say quickly. But
land rights legislation.
There's been land rights legislation, and there's been sort of homelands where Aboriginal people have, some control over their land. There's always an issue with mining. They might own their own land, but they can't stop mining on it. There's native title, which has caused all sorts of problems, because to get native title recognised, you have to prove unbroken ancestral cultural connections to that land, and that causes problems for people whose life has changed, of course. And also that there will be conflicts between different groups who say this was our traditional land, and others who say no, actually it was ours. So.
You get stolen generations and people not always being able to find the connections.
Yeah.
And have that unbroken history. It's not even their fault.
So is Sydney segregated? Because when I was in Sydney about 20 years ago, I didn't see any Aboriginal people in downtown anyway.
Yeah. It's no that there. I've been walking around Sydney with Aboriginal people. There are Aboriginal people there. You probably just don't. Shall we call it quits then?
Sure. Thanks again.
Mindful of the video.